Hello and thanks for joining us. My name is Nino Di Cara. I'm the founder of Electric Autonomy Canada. And over the last 6 weeks, we've been hosting a series of panel discussions with leaders from across the battery and automotive sectors to explore the potential for a national Canadian electric vehicle battery supply chain. Welcome to this, our 6th and final episode on battery second life. I would first of all like to thank our presenting sponsor, Invest in Canada. Invest in Canada works with global investors to unlock business ventures and facilitate expansion in Canada. We're grateful for their support for this series. In this, the final episode in our discussion series, we focus on battery second life, reuse and in particular, recycling. Following the big announcement last week that Canada is going to mandate that all cars and passenger trucks be zero emission in just 14 years, we need to figure out right now what our national strategy is going to be for EV batteries and the rich materials in them when they're no longer being used in vehicles. How is Canadian innovation leading the way in battery recycling, and what are the economic opportunities? Well, these are some of the issues that we're going to be unpacking today. So to unpack this topic, I'd like to welcome and introduce you to our expert panelists who are going to help set the scene for this important discussion. They are Kunal Phalpher, Chief Commercial Officer at Li-Cycle, Jean-Christophe Lambert, Business Development Manager at Lithion, Zarko Meseldzija, Chief Technical Officer and Director at American Manganese, and Sarah Petrevan, Policy Director at Clean Energy Canada, who will be moderating today's discussion. David Warren from New Fly Industries is unfortunately unable to join us, but we look forward to welcoming David to another discussion panel soon. If you have questions for the panelists, please submit them to the Q&A throughout the discussion, and Sarah will get to as many of them as possible. Sarah, thanks for joining us today to moderate today's panel, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Nino. I'm really excited to be moderating what hopes to be a very fruitful conversation. So let's get started. Kunal, I was wondering if I could give you the kickoff question and ask you to talk about what role recycling plays in Canada's battery supply chain currently.
Yeah, I would say, currently you have 3 of 4 Canadian companies really with different technologies on this panel doing lithium-ion battery recycling at different scales and processes in our development. And I would say, just to give the broader context, in North America, there's only not so many more companies than that. So I would say that Canada in its own, and the gentlemen joining us on the panel are punching above our weight with respect to innovating and developing new processes that can be applied in this sector. Taking the other side of that, Canada, our population, just with any product or service, relative to our neighbors down south or other markets like Europe, you're naturally going to have fewer batteries here, whether it's from portable electronics or EVs. So the opportunity for us Canadian companies is, of course, at home here, but then to also take that to other markets, because recycling, at least a portion of it, needs to be more localized in order to capture that battery supply that needs to be recycled and processed.
Zarko, we spend a lot of time talking about the transition to electric vehicles, and obviously a huge part of that are the OEMs, and what commitments are they making, what models are they bringing to market, but maybe what hasn't been talked about as much is how they are or aren't prioritizing battery recycling. And so I was wondering if you could talk about a little bit about how you feel they should be prioritizing battery recycling as part of their business plans in their shift to electric vehicles.
Sure. It's definitely tough without a biased approach to say that this should be a priority. I think any aspect of the supply chain should be a priority equally. And I mean, recycling is just the next logical step in this business plan. This is an important question for American Manganese because we focus our resources and development of our hydrometallurgical process to be integrated with these OEMs via licensing or joint development agreements. You know, I look at companies such as Tesla, Volkswagen, Renault, Volvo, who've all announced some form of a vertical integration plan that's focused on expanding into mining, refining, cathode material production, or even cell production. And that's as an effort to take control of their battery material supply chain. And although I can appreciate it, it does seem like, you know, I can appreciate the upstream efforts, but downstream of that and downstream of end-of-life batteries, it doesn't seem like there is much of a priority there. And you know, that can sometimes it seems that some of that material seems to be passed on versus taking that control in-house, which would more align with their other integration strategies. You know, currently you see downstream of end-of-life batteries include shredding and pyro methods, but then there's a lack of commercial operations even in North America, and therefore you lose that circularity there as well by not integrating recycling.
Jean-Christophe.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that I think that, you know, the recycling portion is also important if we want to have something that's a little bit more local. I think it's interesting to see the movement that we've been seeing in the past years, especially going from Asian production towards more what's happening in Europe and now even North America. We've seen all these announcements for cell manufacturing plants, and I think that eventually that will help to have something that's a little bit more localized, which is something I think we want to tend to in terms of dependency, but as well as supply chain security, you know, national security issues, all of that. So I think the recycling, as Zarko mentioned, is one way. Mining is an important sector in Canada for that, to support that effort, but recycling is another way to achieve that as well. So I think that's another portion of the battery supply chain that OEMs might want to have a look further down the road.
Yes, Sarah, if I could just react a couple of things there. I mean, I think there is an increased effort to look at the after sales market, and especially in warranty batteries, to see how they can bring that back into their supply chain and circularity, especially as more of the OEMs take more of an interest also in the cell manufacturing side through partnerships. And just to add to some comments that were made, I mean, there are commercial recycling. We have 2 plants, one on each side of the border, commercially operating and recycling batteries coming out of vehicles today. So I think that the industry is growing, and compared to 4 years ago, I think there's been a lot of development, and now we're seeing a lot of models from the major, you know, traditional OEMs hit the road, and so the volume is coming, and the interest and attention to this topic is drastically increased, I would say, ironically, during the pandemic period. But this was always the target period in which a lot of these models were expected to be released by a lot of the OEMs.
So that's a great segue into our next question, which I'll start with Jean-Christophe to answer. But, you know, volume and targets, big business these days globally, but also in Canada. So recently we saw the government of Canada increase its 100% EV sales target to 2035, moving it down from 2040. So Jean-Christophe, what impact, if any, do you think that this is going to have on battery recycling?
Yeah, you know, Sarah, that is definitely encouraging. You know, moving that 5-year period a little sooner. Obviously, when we're talking about short-term recycling, I think that the impact we'll probably see if it's encouraging in the next year or two about the sales of EVs in Canada, and that we see an increase due to this new target. Especially when we consider, you know, electric vehicles, often the battery lifespan is quite great at the moment. You know, with the new technologies coming out, I think that we're going to see more and more of these batteries lasting longer and longer. So I think that if we look at in a 2030 perspective, that's still a little bit ahead of us. So most of the recycling industry in Canada and in North America in general will mostly develop around battery manufacturing scrap that will be available through that. So I think that if EV sales in Canada do increase and that we're able to attract more battery manufacturing due to that in Canada, then in the short or midterm, that is going to have a major impact on recycling. But I think that apart from this, we'll still have to wait a few years before we see the impact coming from end-of-life electric vehicles due to this new target.
Kunal, I think as Nino advised us earlier today, there's been a lot of interest throughout these series of panels about the role of battery recycling in the EV supply chain. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the expectation that is being placed on battery recyclers, particularly from EV and battery cell manufacturers. What are they really looking for to happen in battery recycling?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Jean-Christophe said, the major end of life challenge is going to be late 2028 to 2030 here in North America. That's when you start to see significant volumes. But as all this manufacturing is ramping up, there's a need for material with high, contents of nickel and cobalt to be recovered and reprocessed in some form. And this is all driven by the critical materials, or the demand for critical materials, nickel, cobalt, lithium, and security of supply issues. It doesn't matter what industry expert you look at data-wise. There's all these projections of how many vehicles that every OEM wants to produce, which means they need X amount of cells, which is a bottleneck. That's why we see all these announcements about new cell production, but then that puts a strain on the raw material supply. So seeking out new sources and secure sources of supply, especially domestic supply here in North America. And then on top of that, sustainable supply, lower environmental impact material to complement, of course, we still need primary material, we still need an increase in production in primary material. But let's not forget the OEMs are operating globally. A lot of them are operating, for example, in Europe, where policy is already coming, requiring recycled materials, same in China that already exists. So everyone's taking the same sort of approach globally that look for more sustainable sources or to improve the recycled content overall in the vehicle, or at least in the battery.
Yeah, I just want to maybe add to that as well, because when we talk about the domestic supply of some of these materials like cobalt, nickel, lithium, the recycling processes we see now, it's Canada or the US doesn't have cathode manufacturing capacity, so it's still resources recovered here are sent overseas to be processed and then sold back to the EV OEM or battery manufacturers that are interested in that material. So it's not staying domestically with some of these current methods. And also just clarify on that, like lack of commercial capacity, I was more so referring to the hydrometallurgical capacity, because we do see a lot of pyro and shredding and that crude material or that intermediate material being sent away as well overseas for additional processing.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, I mean, first the cathode production will come. I mean, we've seen it in Europe. Number of cell manufacturers announced projects, and then you have the cathode production. And I think all the OEMs are looking at how do you, recycling coming. There's a number of companies here, and everyone's working on it. And then that's the natural step. And I think that's not, my personal predictions by 2025, you'll see some of that here for sure, because everyone wants to create that domestic supply chain, just like you have with the ICE car. All the parts or majority of the parts are made locally to where the car is made. You already see that where the cell manufacturing is being positioned, and that will just continue the push to fill in the gaps in the entire supply chain.
Yeah, I think even on a localized standpoint, we've seen some of these operations really centered into specific hubs, in North America, especially in the US. I think we in the Nevada region, and then we've seen it a little bit more southeast of the US and all the Midwest region. Hopefully one of the things we'll see, I think hopefully in the future, is how Canada can become one of these major hubs for that battery supply chain. I think provincial governments have been putting a lot of effort into that. Either Ontario, Quebec, and I think that one thing that, coming back to the first question, but I think it comes back to also that support that was given by government to this innovation standpoint, where that's why you have maybe three companies that are leading the way today in recycling in Canada for North America. So I think that if we continue that growth and that desire to build this kind of hub here in Canada, it could certainly become maybe the fourth major one in North America in the future.
So I know that there's a lot of interest, and I'm seeing it come up in the questions from our audience about the relationship between OEMs and battery recyclers. So we know that, in OEMs, as they're coming out with their electrified vehicles, they're building relationships with different battery manufacturers. And so Zarko, I'm wondering if you could talk maybe about how you see competition changing over time with OEMs to try and build a relationship with a particular battery recycler. So in the same way that, GM works with LG Chem or Tesla works with Panasonic, do you see OEMs competing to build relationships with battery recyclers in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it's still very young, and seeing what their interest is and how they align their business. Because one thing I'm looking at first is where that threshold is for integration versus a disposal kind of partnership, like giving it off to an independent recycler. So for example, smaller companies are producing electronic waste. Maybe they're expected to only produce a few tons of end-of-life batteries annually, and they may not have the capital or capacity to integrate recycling within their operations. So I think they would dispose of their batteries to an independent recycler as a cost of business. And in this case, I think there's shredding and pyro options available, which may even lead to, maybe bidding wars if there's many recyclers to secure that feedstock. But then I look at larger companies, such as Volkswagen, Tesla, and even Apple, who are expected to produce thousands of tons of end-of-life batteries. And then we can see that they're already investing in their own collection and shredding operations, and they're looking at that whole integration piece within their own business. And I think there's a certain level of material handling know-how and IP required for advancing for that advanced hydrometallurgical processing and the upcycling of that material. So I think that could encourage integration of de-risked and efficient processes like our recyclical process. So really, I don't think one or the other is wrong. Some companies, producing thousands of tons, as summary, producing thousands of tons, are looking maybe to integrate that and keep that all within in-house, while others need that independent recycler who can dispose of the material for them.
Yeah, I think there's a question also of skill set, especially when we're going into the hydrometallurgy portion of the process for recycling. Obviously, we're talking about a chemical process and chemical plants. It's obviously, I think that the OEM can enter in at maybe an earlier stage in the role of what he wants to do and how he wants to get involved in the battery recycling. But at the end of the day, chemical processes are a different ball game. So we might see also integration on the other side of the production, with the cathode manufacturing, for example, or precursor. I think that there might be, corporations on that front as well, because that expertise is there. So I think that it makes also sense to see collaborations within the supply chain at different levels. Even, with the cell manufacturing, there's been announcements, in the industry for collaborations with recyclers as well, simply because, that there was natural fit in the feedstock, in the need to reintroduce that recycled material in the supply chain directly. So it's even got a name now. Now I think that direct recycling before was more related to a certain type of technology of recycling, but today now people kind of see direct recycling as really getting it out from the battery plant and going directly straight up to recycling. So those are different combinations that I think we'll see more and more.
Yeah, exactly. That you said it right, with that knowledge base and know-how of dealing with that material. You see, we talk a lot earlier about the manufacturing scrap, and if that manufacturing scrap is 10-20% is produced at the facility, and you can integrate a recycling chemical process to produce material that can be directly integrated back, then it just seems like a fit for that in that case.
Okay, so Jean-Christophe, I'm going to pose the next question to you to start, and maybe Zarko and Kunal would like to weigh in. But given some of the processes involved in recycling batteries, what do you think the barriers are to being able to recycle 100% of the battery? And are these barriers things that can be overcome, and how do we do it?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. First, obviously, there's everything that touches the dismantling, which goes into recycling. So depending on what stage, the recycler is first processing the battery, in our case, we are processing it at the module level. So obviously there's a form of dismantling that needs to happen before that. And those materials can be efficiently recycled. Then at the shredding or dismantling portion, there's what's the efficiency rate that you can get, and then how good you become to industrialization of your process to get out the black mass and the other components that you have in the battery. Most of the barriers will be either economical or technical. On the technical side, for example, the different assembly of batteries is a challenge. Today batteries were not necessarily thought of as, let's put it this way, as eco-design or as designed to recycle. The goal today for assembling batteries is to reduce the cost. We want to make them more affordable. We want to make them more performant. Eventually, I think that eco-recycling and all of that and eco-design will come into play, but it still needs to happen. On the hydrometallurgy side, obviously, a lot of the recovery rates now have been really improved. The hydrometallurgy has allowed that, getting it to over 90%, often of recovery rate. You will still have eventually impurities that you need to take out from the materials to make them battery grade levels. So those impurities, what happens to those once you've been processing them and all of that, I think that work will come through time, but I think that most recyclers today are focused on getting that material out, extracting it, and bringing it to the right form and purity so that it can be reusable by the cathode industry. That's the core focus today that we need to make happen. Getting from a 50% recovery rate to a 95 or 97 is already an extreme, huge gap. So getting to 100%, I think there's still things in the industry that will need to change in things in processes. But I don't say it's not achievable. I think it's just that there's still one step before that needs to come.
So maybe I'll just hot pursuit what you were just saying there, Jean-Christophe, with one of the questions that were posed by a member of our audience. And that is, how big of a problem is it for your business that batteries aren't necessarily built to be recycled? And do you feel that there's enough of a conversation happening between recyclers and the R&D sector to plan ahead for the recycling process? And maybe each of you want to take a little bit of time trying to elaborate on this, talk about why or why not. And do you have any ideas about how we start this conversation? How do we get this kind of conversation happening?
Yeah, I can comment on that, Sarah. I mean, I think one aspect is that, I've heard OEMs say they're going to design the product for the performance of the vehicle. That's their primary objective. And then the second piece is they also want to start to think about, the first generation vehicles, maybe they didn't think about it as much, but design for servicing. And when you're designing for servicing and making it easy to say, take the modules out of the pack and replace them, you're in a way also designing it for ease of taking things out and designing it for recycling. But we've seen that the R&D teams and the various OEMs are always thinking, and it goes back to what Jean-Christophe was saying, thinking of what other materials to use, or is there change in material to reduce potentially those impurities in the recycling. But I think on the flip side, it's almost like we should make our processes, and that's our approach that we've taken, is be as flexible as possible. Cathode chemistries are going to change, design is going to change of the packs. This is a very rapidly evolving industry and technology. So you want to make if you can make the recycling technology as robust and flexible as possible to accommodate that, because each OEM and each battery maker is going to have a slightly different flavor of how they build the battery cell or pack or module or whatever. And I think that's the approach as the recyclers we should take.
Yeah, I'd say from our process, I mean, we've introduced some flexibility in the materials that we're taking in, because you are seeing a mixed batch. Integration, I think, is going to be an important part. I mean, your larger companies are maybe more so dealing with a homogeneous feedstock of specific batteries, but then there's always the mixture of the chemistries. The NMCs we've seen change from equal portions of nickel, manganese, and cobalt to the higher nickel NMC 811. And what we've been demonstrating with some of our lab testing is taking this mixed batch of NMC waste material and readjusting it in solution to produce cathode precursor materials to a stoichiometric ratio that's more modern to today.
I think that, just to comment on that as well, I think that one of the things that people will tend to look at, and Sarah, you mentioned, all the R&D aspect that's happening. I know we've been having this conversation with some R&D institutions across Canada and in Quebec. I think that there's a conversation that will be happening, in the design of the modules of the pack. That is something that will also maybe tend to develop a little bit more here locally. We've seen some of the heavy duty companies in Canada that have been working on that portion of the assembly of the supply chain. But there's also aspects of the design of the cells also that could also, even if you go deeper on how are you able to extract more and more components and increase that recovery rate on the way you're fabricating those cells in the first place, either by using the different polymers or there's things there that have been developing continuously in some of the R&D work that the cell manufacturers do, that eventually I think will help recyclers in the end. I think, as Kunal mentioned, it is important for us to be prepared and to have the right process in place to be extremely robust, but R&D will play a role into this and will facilitate things in the future, I think, as well.
Okay, so I think for our next question, I want to kind of combine a question that is always on my mind and combine it with something that a member of our audience asked. So I wanted to talk about like second life battery applications and how that compares to recycling, because I think there's lots of conversation out there about what you could actually use a battery for, and do you need to recycle it? Could it be decommissioned out of a car and used, for example, in a grid application? But we also see companies like Tesla, which are moving towards a closed loop system where they become the major customer for their own recycled battery materials. So I was wondering if each of you wanted to take a moment to just elaborate on where you see the opportunities for batteries. Is it in second life? Is it in recycling? Are we going to see more OEMs move towards a Tesla model? What do you think is going to happen?
I feel like everybody here will push towards recycling, but I'll start and I'll say, I do see value in the second life applications, but I think economically it's challenging, just not diving too deep into it. The just costs associated with labor of handling, testing, repacking the batteries, and then versus the manufacturing guarantees are offered, and then the customer's willingness to pay, I think, is the biggest one, because I think in the past decade we've saw prices of batteries go down from $1,000 per kilowatt hour to 100, and if that keeps going, the second life battery costs will also keep decreasing. So, how does that look like in the future when a new battery becomes cheaper?
Yeah, I mean, I think Zarko hit it on the nail on the head. The cost differential between a used and new battery by the time you re-engineer it doesn't provide the best economics. I think also the critical material strategies of these companies, as we've been talking about, lends itself to recycling. You want to be able to secure supply of raw materials, and reuse just delays recycling. Eventually it's going to be recycled anyway. And the other thing is, when you look at the energy storage market, let's take, grid scale storage probably takes the most number of batteries. For utilities have a long-term mindset. They think about 40-year assets. Solar parks are 25, 30-year assets. So are they really going to invest in a 3-year or 4-year battery asset versus a brand new one that's 10 or 15 years that you can easily finance, it has a warranty? So the segment for reuse is really a lot of backup power. And I've heard some people call it do-it-yourself projects, or maybe commercial and industrial projects. But that market segment, when we look, and I think Jean-Christophe was talking about, 10 years down the road, when you have high volume of vehicles coming off the road, that volume of batteries way larger than the market for energy storage. So from a kilowatt hour, gigawatt hour value. So you're not going to be able to reuse all those batteries in projects. You can't. So there's just a lot of economic and actual market challenges with reuse. Not saying that there's probably some siphoned, from EVs to some reuse, but the percentage is small. It's a lot of pilot projects still, as people try and figure out a business model for it.
One of the things also I think we'll see more and more happening in the short midterm is, and I think it was Kunal who did mention it a little bit, but was that OEMs today are developing the capacity through their dealership network or their external parties to be able to dismantle themselves and get the battery out of the car and not change necessarily completely the battery pack. Go to the modules and change. I don't think they will necessarily have the capacity to go in the short term, midterm to the cells, but the modules at least, tend to help them to not go and put to waste the entire battery pack. And modules are easily, transportable and could go to a recycler directly, and especially if they are true end of life, then that means it needs to go to recycling. So I think that availability of batteries going to a potential second life application might be reduced due to that fact that OEMs will get better and better at changing batteries. And recyclers will eventually receive a little bit less full battery packs and maybe a little bit more modules.
Okay, so I'm seeing this question come up a couple of times. So in Canada today, battery comes to its end of life. What happens to it?
I guess if we're talking about EV batteries, I mean, a majority of, and end of life could also mean premature death, let's call it, or midlife crisis, right? So you go to get it repaired. Since EVs haven't been around that long, a majority of them are still under warranty. So that's where relationships with OEMs, they'll have one, maybe two, in some cases, national suppliers who will, for example, we will arrange for the battery to be picked up from the dealer and brought to our facility in Kingston, where I am today, Kingston, Ontario, and processed. So it's happening amongst the OEMs through the warranty, through the repairs that are done at the dealership. And then there's obviously the accidents where batteries then get taken over by the insurance companies and then into auto scrap yards. That's another channel, but it's definitely a smaller percentage right now. But in the long run, most of these will die when they're out of warranty. And so that's the future channel or pathway where batteries will go through. And then it's up to us on the panel to access those and build those relationships to bring them back to a recycling facility.
So there's no law mandating that batteries have to be recycled now, is there?
No,
no, there is. I think that when we're talking about the OEMs directly, I think there's a will clearly to make sure that, because they're conscious of the fact that we're dealing with materials that can be dangerous. We've seen, even I think it was yesterday, a case, in the US where still there was, a huge fire in a recycling facility. I think these news have been happening, in the past few years, over and over, and that is something we want to avoid as much as we can. So I think that, the OEMs are really cautious of that, and they want to make sure that the batteries find the right way. The thing is with the regulation is what happens when these batteries are no under warranty anymore, and then they go into other streams. Either they go at a scrapyard facility or at another type of facility that was used for reuse, for example, or anything. And what happens to that battery, and how is it stored? How is it transported properly? All of that. I think this is where regulation can be extremely important to make sure that we have a good framework to protect, the operators, the people handling this material. And there are also other streams. Lithium-ion batteries are also present in other applications. Energy storage or consumer electronics, where you'll have agglomerators of these batteries through deposit points and all of that, where those can come also to recycling in the future.
So switching gears a little bit, let's talk about the Canada-US relationship. There's lots of conversation, particularly when we're talking about electric vehicles, about the integrated market between Canada and the US. And so maybe let's talk about that integration in the area of battery recycling. Do you see the relationship evolving between the US and Canada in the field of battery recycling? And how do you think companies are going to evaluate where to put recycling plants? Are they going to be in Canada? Are they going to be in the US? And, just to be clear, I want to pose this question to each of you.
Yeah, sorry, I'll maybe start off and maybe go back to the previous question a little bit as well, because I think we're recycling being at the source is, with battery manufacturing, we're talking about scraps. Being at the source seems like the logical step, avoiding transportation, processing it directly there or in a co-located facility to reintroduce that material. But back to the other question, when we look at what happens to these batteries, when we look at it from the materials perspective, there's efforts in like Europe with a battery passport to show the provenance of these battery materials, right? And what that really would show us when we're looking at processing the end-of-life battery and following those materials around in whichever way they're processed, whether the battery is shredded or it's burnt in high heat, that material still is, somebody's going to try and extract that. And really what that battery passport, if that was ever come online, what it would show us is it's shipped overseas. It's not in the US or Canada. Because like I mentioned earlier, there's no, the cathode manufacturing capacity. So I think it's US and Canada need to have that relationship where they control all aspects of that supply chain, because even if it's mined or if it's recycled, those intermediate products need to be sent for further processing. And I haven't seen any immediate plans on that cathode manufacturing. It's primarily dominated in, Asia Pacific region.
Yeah, maybe Sarah, to add to your question about location, I mean, Zarko covered one where you're manufacturing batteries, there's gonna be a lot of waste. So, co-location is the ideal, but then from other aspects, afterlife, we sort of follow population centers, logistics routes, because you're looking at electronic waste, EVs, et cetera. And so, for example, I mean, Kingston here in Canada it started off due to our R&D partners being here, but also logistically, we're in the middle of a large population from Windsor to Montreal, large corridor of population. So it's also helpful. But for example, we're building something in Phoenix now for that front end processing, what we call our spoke, which is shredding and creating the intermediate products. So there you're close to California and the Southwest where there's high EV penetration. For the hydrometallurgy side, our considerations were a bit different. So our model is what we call our spoke and hub. We'll have decentralized shredding to create intermediate products. Then you have an inert product, like what they call black mass, and we bring it to our hydromet facility, which we decided to build in Rochester, New York, where we already have a spoke. But there is because of the infrastructure. So the former Kodak facility, what they call the Eastman Business Park, was built for chemical processing. And so there's a lot of legacy infrastructure that we could leverage to build out that hydromet facility, which will be operational end of next year. And what Zarko's saying is also correct, that, you know, the materials will go overseas at first from there. But I think from conversations we had, there's definitely a will for groups, whether it's the OEMs pressuring the cell manufacturer pressuring their supply chain, and then also on top of that, Canada and US taking an active approach in this to bring that missing step now into the North American mix. And so Canada, US, you know, that front end process is always going to be close to where the processing is. So you're not going to, we have to date, as we scaled up, brought material from California to Kingston, but that's not the end game. The end game is to have the at least first phase of processing closer. But then when you get into the hydrometallurgy, that's going to be more centralized, large scale. And then obviously you want to have it more integrated then, and how you can get that closer to cathode and cell production is the next phase of growth for the supply chain here in North America. But it takes time to get there.
Yeah, I think that the ecosystems, you know, of these industries are going to affect a lot. You know, in our case, you know, government of Quebec has been really vocal and supportive of the battery supply chain and then how they want to support it here locally. So it is making sense, you know, for us to continue to develop our growth in Canada here in Quebec, both for the shredding and the hydrometallurgy. So we do see an opportunity here, you know, as also Quebec being also a really strong market for EV penetration in Canada. Obviously, BC is catching up with the huge growth, but I think that Quebec has been a leader in that space for quite some time. So it is a good opportunity for us to develop here with the R&D and the different players that are established outside of recycling, but still in the EV space here in Quebec. And I think that's going to follow also our trends in developing in the US, you know, trying to find places where there's already an EV strong ecosystem and EV penetration for dismantling and shredding. So this also can play a role in what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, maybe I'd also just like to add on that, you know, with our recyclable process, there was a good point saying, you know, there is a big push on all those segments of the supply chain, including cathode manufacturing. And I think we're really trying to even fill that gap with, you know, some of our recent press releases and company news. With our process, it's the approach of not recycling down into the intermediate, but I think where we're differing with Recyclico is going directly into precursor material. So that's a step that, you know, really compresses some of those steps in the supply chain together.
So I think we've got time for a couple more questions. And one interesting audience question came to us. And that is that depending on the process used, there's a feeling that battery recycling is actually quite polluting. And our audience was wondering if the panel could comment on that.
I guess that depends on processing techniques. You know, there's different methods. Like if we're going the pre-treatment step with the whole module or pack, you know, you got your options of high heat or shredding, and shredding also has its different breakdowns of, you know, whether you're shredding in solution or whether, and then you'll maybe have some water waste that needs to be cleaned, or you're shredding in a dry environment or inert environment. And then when it comes to the chemical processing, I mean, that depends on the reagents that are being used as well, because I mean, it doesn't sound exciting, but when you do the full mass balance, right, you got to see how much water is being consumed, how much is it being circulated back, is the solution being reused? And in those cases, yeah, there could be what we've seen with processes and how we've developed ours is trying, you know, having everything in a closed loop process. So the solution is reused. You know, we're using reagents that aren't, you know, highly consuming other reagents a lot, and also driving up the economics. So there is a lot of factors in there that you can really get into some of the technical details versus just extraction and purities.
Yeah, I would add, there are processes, even so there's a pyro process, which is straight thermal treatment. There are shredding processes that still try to use a thermal process. That's not the way we've gone, but the thermal treatment of batteries is where you end up with fluorinated compounds and emissions, which that's the detrimental piece to the, let's say, air emissions. On the water side, of course, we don't actually, with our shredding, we don't produce any wastewater. And then again, on the hydromet side, it's a closed loop system. So you try to minimize and not having any effluent is how you minimize your environmental impact. And the benchmark, I mean, we can benchmark recycling process to recycling process too, but it's also important to benchmark to primary materials where there's already significant GHG saving and also water saving when you produce the same materials. So that's the other benchmark that we have as an industry, which, I mean, it doesn't matter any of the three processes. I don't know the details of Zarko and Jean-Christophe's process, but I bet it's better than primary resources in terms of environmental impact.
Thanks all. Okay, so I'm wondering, so we know that battery recycling is, it's an industry of today, but it's an industry that is likely going to grow in the future. And I'm wondering if each of you have thoughts on how an industry like battery recycling can help build new economic bases for Indigenous communities.
Yeah, I think one aspect maybe is, I mean, we still need to collect batteries, and a lot of the Indigenous communities, or some of them, tend to be off-grid or isolated. I imagine that there's going to be a transition from some of the batteries that they use are lead acid. I know the Responsible Battery Coalition had a drive or a program where they were collecting from northern communities a number of lead acid batteries that will convert to lithium ion. So from the collection perspective, I think there's an opportunity there to ensure that something appropriate is being done with the batteries used in the community. I think, it doesn't matter sort of what the community is. The geography, as you heard from all of us, is important, of where you locate a plant proximal. So if there's Indigenous community proximal to population centers, then that would make sense. But the real driving factor is the population center, and things like EV penetration is what's important for placing a facility.
Yeah, I think there might be an opportunity. I don't know, for lithium-ion batteries being used. I know that a lot of the Indigenous communities in Quebec, for example, are closely linked, to energy storage and utilities. So where there be opportunities coming from that, in terms of, as Kunal mentioned, from the collection standpoint, due to the fact that I'm not necessarily thinking about EV here, because I don't think, I think that EV penetration in some of the a little bit more distant locations here in the territory of Canada, which is so huge. That's the thing, and transportation is one of the key factors affecting recycling as well. As how do we limit that cost as much as we can? So I think that energy storage might be a place where you'll have some opportunities as well in that, because these batteries will have to be recycled too. It's not just about the electric vehicles.
Maybe just that is, from a mining background, we see, a lot of mining projects affect the Indigenous communities, and there's always lots of debate on permitting and allowing the use of that land. Where, I mean, recycling or urban mining doesn't affect some of those sacred lands.
So we have, I think, time for one more question, and I want to add something in from somebody in the audience, and then maybe add my own spin on the end. But let's look at how the recycling sector is going to evolve over the next 10 years. So to close, maybe let's talk about what are going to be the needs in terms of a skilled workforce. If we get to the point where there's going to be mass recycling What kind of training are people going to need? How urgent is this growing need going to be? And then maybe just to add to that and say, we're thinking about the next 10 years and what that's going to look like in 10 years. Where will you all be? How will your industry have evolved? Where are we going to be in 10 years in terms of workforce, in terms of companies, in terms of recycling stock? Start dreaming big. Go for it.
I can start with that one. So I think that, in terms of employment and operation, obviously, you need a certain level of trained pooled workforce, so that's why I think that, maybe some large agglomerations will be a little bit more favorable for that, especially if we're talking about hydrometallurgists or chemists or even in the pretreatment process, the operators that you need to deal with these large battery packs need to have a certain high level of training, because you're dealing with something that can potentially kill you. It's not that simple. So you want to make sure that you have this pool of talent available in terms of engineers and all that. In terms of where Lithion sees itself in 10 years, I think that our goal is to have a footprint here in North America, but as well in Europe, both for the hydrometallurgy portion of the process as well as the pre-treatment. So I think that we can imagine at least a hub for each region where we have our hydrometallurgy plants and as well the different pre-treatment facilities that can feed those two hubs. I think that this is an important point that we need to make it happen. And we need that volume of recycling to be available for OEMs and battery manufacturers, so to make sure it happens.
Yeah, similarly, I mean, we're on a path, and that's why what we've announced in our statements regarding going public, that we want to be a global company. The challenge is global, and some of a lot of the customers are global OEMs. So, we're looking at Europe and Asia as our regions to expand into, to build capacity. And I think the capacity we need in that 10-year time frame, throw out some numbers. I mean, the total available material for recycling, we estimated about 2.5 million tons of battery materials and batteries, say by 2030. So there needs to be a significant investment in the next 5-7 years to build out that capacity. And it's not going to be done by one company. And so there's a lot of opportunity coming even here in North America now, as more and more manufacturing gets announced, and policies like Canada announced for the 2035 goal. So yeah, there's definitely opportunities in terms of workforce. I mean, I think Jean-Christophe kind of hit it on the head there too. But I mean, the hydromet side, it's similar expertise that we see in mining and metals. So there's just an adaptation or learning this process. But I mean, the workforce and skill sets there. And then when we get into the shredding side, as we place plants, Kingston, Rochester, Phoenix, and elsewhere, you just have to find local operational staff, operators from manufacturing type environments that can be trained easily and learn the process. And the key there is understanding the safety risks around lithium-ion batteries and the handling requirements. But that's all achievable. It's not a super unique workforce that you need. I think you can find the right people.
Yeah, on our end, just to repeat again, is skilled workforce, hydrometallurgists, chemical engineers, just mechanical engineers, and you do see those skill sets as well, like Kunal said, in mining as well. But and what I mentioned earlier in the talk as well, I mean, I think the recycling industry is going to be segmented in a way where there is going to be, like I said, those smaller companies, or they're producing a few tons of end-of-life batteries and need to dispose of that. And I think there will be locations for those materials to be sent and recycled. But then I also think on the other spectrum, there's going to be large companies that want to take control of that supply chain. And that's where I see American Manganese integrating. So with battery manufacturers and the large EV OEMs, integrating our know-how and IP into processing that material and recovering it directly, all staying in-house within like a gigafactory or an EV OEM was just essentially keeping that within their whole supply chain. So, I mean, I could see a future where EV manufacturers going from mining, refining, producing the batteries in cars, and then also recycling them, and that material never leaves the loop. So, and that's throughout North America, Europe, Asia, in our perspective. And I also think, there's going to be constant iteration. We're seeing, lots of new development in battery technology, and I think recycling is just going to have to keep up with that, and always iterate, always make sure you can process the next batch of new technology, and be flexible with that.
Kunal, Jean-Christophe, Zarko, I want to thank you very much for your insights today. And Nino, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Sarah, well, thanks very much for the excellent moderation today and taking us through that just fantastic discussion. I do want to say a massive thank you to Kunal and Zarko and Jean-Christophe for bringing their expertise to the discussion today. Recycling is something that I get asked about every time I speak about EVs, and from the questions today, it's clear that people obviously see EVs as a solution to help resolve the climate crisis, but it's not necessarily but obviously making sure that we're not creating another problem on the recycling end. And the panel today have been excellent in addressing that. So thank you to you all. Thanks for everybody who asked questions. We got through a good number of them, but I'm sorry we weren't able to reach them all. Great way to wrap up our 6-part webinar series. It's been an incredible 6-week of discussion. One thing that is clear is that sector leaders from across Canada's automotive and EV battery supply chain see enormous economic potential for Canada to embrace a national integrated strategy. And another thing that's clear is their enthusiasm and ambition to take part in it. It's evident from the feedback that we've received that this discussion series hosted by Electric Autonomy Canada has helped move the dial forward. But for us now, we're thinking about what comes next. And so, I'd like to invite everybody in the audience to share your thoughts with us on how you'd like electric autonomy to follow through on this series. Excuse me. And you can go to our website at electricautonomy.ca, go to the contact page and submit comments in there. We would absolutely love to hear from you on, how you think we should be addressing, all the number of topics that we've been addressing in this series next. So a massive thank you overall to the 25 industry leaders who've brought their expertise to the various panels that we've been hosting in this series, to all of our collaborators in government and business who helped make this series what it is, and to our audience for the 2,500 registrations that we received across the total number of webinars. And of course, a special big thank you to our presenting sponsor, Investing Canada, for coming on board to support this series. On a personal note, I'd like to thank my team at Electric Autonomy Canada, Emma Jarrett, Charlotte Craig, Brian Banks, and Victoria Reid, who've brought so much to bring this series to life. A recording of this event will be posted on the Electric Autonomy website, along with all the other episodes from the other parts of this series. So please do go and check those out if you want to go back and check on details from some of the previous conversations. Thanks very much for joining us.